This is a Cold War story that didn't become well known about in the West until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this video, we're going to take a look at the deadly legacy of the USSR's abandoned terrestrial radioisotope thermal generators, or RTGs for short. First though, I'm going to hand over to Matt Damon in the 2015 movie The Martian to give you an introduction into RTGs.
Good news, I may have a solution to my heating problem. Bad news, it involves me digging up the radioisotope thermoelectric generator. Now, if I remember my training correctly, one of the lessons was titled, "Don't dig up the big box of plutonium, Mark." I get it, RTGs are good for spacecraft, but if they rupture around humans, no more humans. Which is why we buried it when we arrived. And planted that flag so we would never be stupid enough to accidentally go near it again. But, as long as I don't break it.
I almost just said everything will be fine out loud. Look, the point is, I'm not cold anymore. And sure, I could choose to think about the fact that I'm warm because I have a decaying radioactive isotope riding right behind me, but right now I got bigger problems on my hands.
Although The Martian is science fiction, the RTG that Matt Damon is digging up isn't. These are NASA RTGs that were used on the Cassini spacecraft, and this is a photo from 1997 where a technician is measuring the external radiation on the RTG. RTGs have been used to power long-range spacecraft since the early 1970s, but generally they're not used for manned space travel or satellites due to the risk to humans. It was, of course, the 1986 Chernobyl disaster that disclosed to the Western world the woeful state of the USSR's nuclear facilities and the Soviet state's cavalier attitude to radiological safety and poor nuclear engineering. So, if the West only used RTGs for long-range space travel due to the risk they presented to humans, how on earth did the Soviet Union end up littering their countryside with over 2,500 devices every bit as radioactive as an RBMK reactor? The story begins well before the invention of nuclear power, in the years immediately after World War II. Before the war, throughout the Soviet Union, the farms and rural communities had been collectivised and were now run by the state as a socialist enterprise. The peasants now toiled the fields in remote areas supervised by communist commissars as part of a great socialist endeavour. These shiny happy people, that's where the REM reference comes from, needed organising, and they needed educating politically and motivating. And one of the tools to do that, then, as it is now, was by the mainstream media. Strictly censored and vetted printed material and state-run newspapers had a major role to play in propaganda. But one of the best devices in the early 1950s, bearing in mind a lot of the Soviet population in the rural areas were illiterate, was the use of the radio. With the use of shortwave radio, Moscow could effectively talk to the whole Soviet population at once, with a very strictly controlled narrative, and therefore state-constructed radios like this one were rolled out across communities throughout the USSR. There was one major problem to all of this. Rural communities across the Soviet Union did not have electricity. But Soviet engineers had come up with a solution to that. These radios would be powered by a thermal electrical generator, powered by a kerosene lantern, that you can see to the rear right of this photograph. These kerosene lantern electrical generators relied on very simple technology, which took advantage of the Seebeck effect. Discovered in 1821 by Thomas Johann Seebeck, applying heat to a semiconductor and cooling the inverse side of that conductor induced an electrical current between the two. This was a very inefficient way of generating electricity, as over 96% of the energy was lost. The Soviet kerosene lantern generators relied on the heat from the lantern flame to heat the hot side of the semiconductor, whilst a crown of cooling fins attached to the top of the lantern would dissipate the heat out into the room, thus inducing enough current to run the shortwave radio. By the mid-1960s, most Soviet rural communities had diesel generators installed, and this type of thermal generator fell into obsolescence. Although the lanterns became obsolescent in the early 1960s, it would be less than a decade before the Soviet Union required Thomas Johann Seebeck's technology again. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had an engineering problem on their hands. The Soviet coastline was over 10,000 miles long, 3/4 of which were located within the Arctic Circle. The northern sea route was hard to navigate and treacherous, but the Soviet government required it for sea trade, but also, more importantly, at the height of the Cold War, for passage for the Soviet Navy. Starting in the early 1970s, the Soviet Union began constructing a chain of over 1,000 lighthouses and radio navigation beacons along its entire coastline, a project that would take well over a decade to complete. There was only one problem. Many of these lighthouses would be hundreds, if not 1,000 miles away from civilization, and during the Arctic winter months could not be visited. So conventional power supplies, such as diesel generation, were not practicable. In looking for a solution to the power supply problem, engineers recalled the success of the kerosene lantern generators used for domestic radios in the 1950s. But now what was needed was enough power to supply a lighthouse and a radio beacon that could be left for years without resupply or maintenance. So now kerosene lanterns would not be enough. Something altogether hotter and more reliable was needed. Step forward, radioisotopes. This is a pressed ceramic ingot of plutonium-238 oxide, as used on the NASA space probes that I showed you at the beginning of the video. It is glowing red hot due to self-heating and is around 800 degrees centigrade. The self-heating is caused by the release of radioactive decay heat. Plutonium-238 has a half-life of 88 years. That means that this particular ingot will be glowing red hot at 800 degrees centigrade for the best part of a century. A very brief look at the physics behind this. Radioactive atoms are unstable and nature abhors instability. So, unstable atoms seek to become more stable by shedding either highly energetic particles or energy, or both, and this is known as radioactive decay. The particles are either alpha particles, which are 2 protons and 2 neutrons, or beta particles, which are highly energetic electrons. Both are forms of ionising radiation and are bad for humans. The excess energy shed can be in the form of highly energetic waves, known as gamma rays, which are ionising, or in heat. Different radioactive atoms decay in different modes. That is either alpha decay, beta decay, or gamma decay. And it should be remembered, not all decay modes are accompanied with the generation of heat. So the takeaway point here is, as well as generating 800 degrees of heat, which is useful to us, this slug of Pu-238 is emitting a fairly horrific level of ionising radiation that you can't see. Pu-238 decays in alpha mode, so it's emitting a storm of alpha particles and maybe a bit of gamma. The red glow here is due to incandescence, that is, non-ionising photons being released from the material due to its high level of heat. No different to putting a piece of steel into a furnace. An important myth I think I need to kill at this point in the video, which will be relevant later, is that radioactive materials do not glow in the dark. This misconception is not helped because certain materials will glow if subjected to ionising radiation, such as phosphor in gaseous tritium light sources on night sights and instrumentation, or the Cherenkov effect, the blue glow seen surrounding water in nuclear reactors. Why is this important? Because human senses cannot detect ionising radiation, no matter how intense and hazardous to the health it is. For example, this is an intensely radioactive cylinder of cobalt-60, a very intense gamma source. Note the ominous warning that says drop and run. Now, if you were to be unfortunate enough to pick this up and hold it in your hand, it would feel cold to the touch. It would not glow in the dark. You would not feel anything. If you held it in your hand for more than 30 seconds, you would lose that hand. If you held it for more than 10 minutes, or you're in the same room as it for more than 10 minutes, it would kill you. Contained within his 1988 whistleblowing memoir, written just for his death, the chief scientific advisor for the Soviet Chernobyl Commission, Valery Legasov, gave a very chilling description of the effect of acute radiation syndrome on the human body. Narrated here by British actor Ade Edmondson.
If it's damaged severely enough, all this radiation will escape. It'll travel through almost anything, drift with the wind, odorless, indiscriminate. And it takes life in silence. Severe exposure to radiation begins a decline that is untreatable and atrocious. After initial dizziness and vomiting, sensitive tissues like the tongue begin to swell. Skin blackens, detaches itself. The cells of your body begin to break down. But your DNA is also grotesquely transformed so that in the days following exposure, you're gradually robbed not just of your life, but of the very thing that makes you the human being you are.
Despite the very real risks of deploying highly radioactive material to completely unsupervised and insecure remote locations, the Soviet engineers designed this terrestrial radioisotope thermal generator to power their lighthouses and radio beacons. This is called a Beta M. It is a mid-1970s designed Soviet terrestrial RTG. It is about 1.5 metres wide and 1.5 metres tall, and it weighs just over 1 metric ton. The Russian words stenciled on the crown of the cooling fan say, Ostorozhno radioaktivnost, or in English, caution, radiation. The body of the Beta M unit is a very heavy cast steel bulkhead, about 10 centimetres thick, and this acts as the outer radiation shield. A heavy 20 centimetre thick machined steel lid seals the unit, but in a very serious design flaw, this is secured only with normal industrial bolts, not intrinsically safe, safety interlocked or tamper-proof bolts, something that will come back to haunt this design in the future. Inside the bulkhead sits an inner tungsten liner, which is the primary radiation shield, and above that the thermal generator and heat exchanger to the cooling fin crown. The heart of the unit, of course, is the radioactive heat source, indicated in red in this diagram, which is about the size of a paint can or a large food can. The power output for the whole unit was 250 watts thermal, equating to electrical wattage of 10 watts, which really doesn't sound much, but you have to remember these units were usually deployed in pairs, and also they charged a battery. They didn't connect directly to the lighthouse. The Beta M radiation heat source looked like this. Unlike spacecraft RTGs, Soviet terrestrial RTGs used strontium-90 as their isotope, not plutonium-238. Why? Because it's cheap. Plutonium is very, very expensive and difficult to produce. Strontium-90 can be refined from civil nuclear reactor waste. But this comes with some serious downsides. The heat output is much lower, and the half-life much shorter. This unit would put out about 400 degrees centigrade, but with a half-life of just 28 years, meaning that every 2 decades the heat source would need to be replaced. Strontium-90 is also very, very hazardous to humans. It mimics calcium in the environment and is a bone seeker, and is readily absorbed into the human body. For that reason, the heat source is sealed into a stainless steel 2 centimetre thick flask and hermetically sealed. Due to the bremsstrahlung effect, the X-ray radiation being emitted from this unit would be about 2 sieverts an hour. And this is a Beta M RTG unit out in the field, in the present-day Russian Federation, looking very sorry for itself and neglected. But trust me on this one is in quite good condition. This appears to be a defunct Soviet radio beacon site. The collapsed radio mast is along the ground behind the unit, and the RTG transit case is very rusted. Quite often you'll find the RTGs deployed in these steel-framed cases. This was to enable them to be underslung from a military helicopter to be deployed. From the 1970s to the late 1980s, over 1,000 Soviet lighthouses and nav beacons were equipped with RTGs, often deployed in pairs for redundancy. During the Soviet years, there were no issues. The technology worked well, and Soviet military maintenance teams had a rolling visit program to check the RTG safety and functions. In fact, so successful was the RTG technology for the Navy, other Soviet ministries adopted that technology for any application that required remote electrical power, such as seismic sensors or radio rebroadcast or repeater stations in the remote Soviet hinterland. By around the year 1989, some 2,500 terrestrial RTGs had been deployed across the whole Soviet Union. Then, in 1991, it all came crashing down. In a few short months, the USSR collapsed both politically and economically, shattering into 16 various independent states. The Soviet ministries that regulated and maintained the RTGs ceased to exist overnight, and the new Russian Federation that now took over most of the old Soviet landmass, where most RTGs were sited, was bankrupt, and they had neither the will nor the money to maintain the infrastructure. If a lighthouse or beacon worked, all well and good. If it broke down, it was simply abandoned, and the RTG left to rot. For the next decade, nobody really cared about these legacy radioactive devices. Not the Russian government, nor the international community, as most RTGs were deployed in remote locations away from governmental and environmental NGO scrutiny, with the exception, maybe, of the most famous RTG site, Aniva Lighthouse in Russia's Far East. Built in 1939 and abandoned in 1991 because of its creepy, gothic, abandoned style, it became an unlikely tourist attraction for tourists and urban explorers. But Aniva Lighthouse was powered by two IEU-2 type RTGs. At least the Russian authorities put up some health and safety signage to warn off tourists. Ostorozhno radioaktivno. Caution, radiation. And on the steps leading up to the lighthouse from the sea, radiatsiya, radiation. Because of Aniva Lighthouse's popularity in the media, it was one of the first to be decommissioned, and the RTGs were removed in 2006, fortuitously having never leaked or been tampered with by tourists. High-profile sites like Aniva Lighthouse, with its well-behaved urban explorers and tourists, was never the problem. It was elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, particularly in the remote, rural Russian Federation, where after 20 years in service and 10 years of neglect, some RTG sites were degrading rapidly. Like this now defunct and really rusty radio navigation beacon site. The RTG unit would have been housed in this rusty equipment shed, completely unsecured and unsupervised by the authorities. Elsewhere in exposed areas, storm weather destroyed woefully inadequate wooden protective enclosures, exposing the RTG unit to Arctic storm conditions, which in turn damaged the unit itself, something that should have been discovered by a maintenance inspection that never came. Unbelievably, some RTG units were intentionally deployed out in the open, disclosing a shocking level of engineering incompetence. This, for instance, is a lighthouse seemingly constructed of waste timber and then hooked up to an early generation RTG left out in the elements. These type of slapdash timber lattice RTG powered lighthouses were not that uncommon in the Soviet wilderness. Built by engineers presumably under time constraints, but with little or no thought to the safety and the risks of the RTG unit that powered them. Eventually and inevitably, the exposed neglected units began to fail. With this RTG, the outer case has been split open by water penetration and freezing in the harsh Russian Arctic. The label POV is Russian for gully or crack. This unit would now be leaking significant amounts of radiation and would be a danger to anyone unfortunate enough to approach it. But weather alone was not the greatest safety threat to the abandoned RTGs. That was, as always is, human stupidity and greed. The abandoned lighthouse and beacon sites provided potential rich pickings for metal thieves and scavengers, who cut away the valuable copper and stole electrical equipment. Some were wise enough not to go anywhere near the RTGs, but many were not. This RTG unit has been attacked by a metal thief, presumably with a sledgehammer, who lacked the tools to open the case. On occasion, metal thieves would be stupid enough to open an RTG case, which, as I described earlier in the video, can be done with just a domestic spanner set. This is a Beta M unit that has been fully dismantled by metal thieves, and the radioactive heat source and tungsten inner radiation shielding removed. According to the International Atomic Energy Authority, the Russian authorities found the radioactive heat source unit about 100 metres away from this Beta M unit and recovered it using a bomb disposal robot. The metal thieves that did this were never caught, but they would almost certainly have suffered very serious radiation sickness and possibly would have died. By the late 1990s, even the Russian government had to admit they had a serious problem on their hands. But with sad inevitability, it would take a serious incident of death and injury to innocent parties to galvanise the international community into dealing with the Soviet RTG problem. And that incident was the Lear event in 2001. Lear is a small town in the Caucasus country of Georgia, Georgia was once part of the Soviet Union, but gained independence in 1991. Our story takes place in December 2001. 3 men from the town took a flatbed truck up into the mountains above Lear, intending to cut wood from the forest to sell on as firewood. Towards the end of the day gathering wood, one of the men found an area in the forest about 5 metres in circumference where the snow had completely melted. In the centre of this circle was a silver metal cylinder that was sizzling like an iron as the snowflakes fell on it and boiled off. Sadly, viewers, I'm pretty sure you've already guessed what this unfortunate woodsman has found. But how would a poorly educated woodsman have any comprehension of the danger he was in? Fascinated by this magical natural heater, the woodsman decided to make a makeshift snare and drag the cylinder to the forest track, to the area where he and his friends were intending to camp for the night. The hot cylinder was propped up against a pile of rocks to reflect the heat back onto the sleeping area. The other woodsman lit a fire, and as night fell, the 3 of them sat around the fire drinking bootleg vodka. After about 2 hours, all 3 woodsmen began vomiting. They had intense headaches, something they attributed to contaminated vodka. They attempted to sleep, but sleep was impossible as the sickness got much worse during the night. Eventually, in the early hours, they could take no more and decided to strike camp and drive back into Lear. Back in Lear, all 3 men began to suffer burning sensations across their entire bodies. Woodsman 1, who had found the cylinder, lost the use of his hands as his fingers had swollen up and it was painful to make a fist. All 3 sought medical attention, and within 7 days, all 3 were hospitalised. Local medics could not deal with the severity of their symptoms, so they were transferred to a military hospital in Tbilisi. At the military hospital, radiation exposure and acute radiation syndrome was diagnosed. And this is footage of all 3 being treated for serious radiation burns 4 weeks now after the incident. Patient 1 was the woodsman who found the metal cylinder, and he was the one that slept closest to it by the pile of rocks at the campfire. Patient 2, the second woodsman, had slept the second closest to the metal cylinder, but about a metre further away than patient 1, and it was this metre that probably saved his life. He had radiation burns to his legs, buttocks and upper back. Patient 3, the third woodsman, slept the furthest away, about 3.5 metres away from the metal cylinder, and he had patchy burns to his upper back only. Due to YouTube community standards, thankfully I cannot show you any more of the medical condition of the woodsman. But Valery Legasov's description was completely accurate earlier in the video. Their decline was horrendous. Radiation burns do not heal like normal burns, and all 3 woodsmen required multiple skin grafts. Also, because their immune systems had been destroyed by the radiation, all 3 needed bone marrow transplants. Thankfully, Woodsman 2 and Woodsman 3 survived their treatment after months in hospital. Sadly, Woodsman 1, patient 1, the guy who found the metal cylinder and slept closest to it, did not live, and he died after months of treatment. Once the woodsmen were diagnosed with a severe radiation exposure and recounted their story about the mysterious hot cylinder they had found in the woods, the Georgian authorities declared a major incident, and physicists began to scour the mountain paths for the lost radiation source. This wasn't difficult because the radiation was detectable miles away, but the isolation took some time, and the source found more or less where the woodsmen described they had left it. The physicists found that the mysterious cylinder was indeed a radioactive heat source from a beta-M type RTG that unknown metal thieves had dismantled on a nearby mountaintop radio relay station, presumably discarding the RTG cylinder near the mountain track. Having located the highly radioactive orphan source, the Georgian army sealed off the mountainous area, and the International Atomic Energy Authority were called in as advisors and trainers to help train a Georgian Civil Defence Corps radioactive source recovery team for what would be a difficult and hazardous operation. Because of the snow and the mountainous terrain, it was not suitable for remote robot recovery of the source. So in scenes similar to the Chernobyl disaster, humans would have to perform the recovery work. Using improvised long-reach tools, each man would have only 45 seconds to approach the source and perform his task. The plan was simple: to drag the source from behind the rocks where the woodsman had left it, onto the mountain track, get it into a two-handed bucket and then tip it into a makeshift 2-ton lead shield mounted on a flatbed truck. After a week of training, the civil defence team were ready to deploy and conduct the operation, but getting up to the Georgian mountains in the middle of winter would not be easy. And this is footage of the actual live recovery operation of the radioactive heat source that had just put 3 Georgian woodsmen into hospital.
No. Stay behind the rock.
No, it's impossible such a way to...
No. Have to clean the snow. Yeah.
Ой, да много.
25 seconds. Next time he goes, isn't it? 30 seconds. Oh, that's okay.
You see, depending on what doses they get.
Yeah.
Не годится. Все. Дайте каргия. Açalım aparatı.
Okay. Well done. 40 microsievert per hour.
3-5-4 минута.
Нела.
Бога оставлю, ты
Нела.
Да, давайте.
Okay.
The Lear event and the recovery operation woke the international community up as to the dangers of orphan Soviet RTGs and the risks they posed to international safety. Over the next decade, the Russian government, co-funded by the EU and the USA, removed over 1,000 legacy RTGs on its territory. Other former Soviet states removed all of theirs. But in 2014, as a punishment for invading Crimea, Russia was expelled from the G8. In retaliation, they withdrew all international cooperation in tracking down and making safe orphan Soviet RTGs.